June 4, 1942, 10:22 a.m., 180 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his deck crews frantically rearming aircraft for the third time that morning. The first wave had struck Midway Island at dawn, achieving moderate success but requiring a second strike to suppress the American base completely. Now American carrier aircraft had been reported in the area, forcing another rearmament change to prepare for naval combat. Bombs were being removed from aircraft, torpedoes installed, a process that left ordnance, fuel lines, and armed aircraft crowded across the flight decks of all four Japanese carriers. Nagumo's force represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Huryu, and Soryu, operating 248 aircraft flown by the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. These were the same ships and crews that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, devastating the American Pacific Fleet. They had raided Darwin, Australia, driven British forces from the Indian Ocean, and dominated every engagement they'd fought. Japanese naval doctrine, tactics, and training had proven superior to all opponents. Victory at Midway would consolidate Japanese control of the Pacific and potentially force America to negotiate a favorable peace. What Nagumo didn't know, what Japanese intelligence had catastrophically failed to discover, was that 3 American carriers were operating in his vicinity: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. American codebreakers had read Japanese communications and positioned their carriers to ambush the Midway invasion force. But even this intelligence advantage seemed insufficient against Japanese numerical and qualitative superiority. The Japanese had more carriers, more aircraft, better trained pilots, and demonstrated tactical excellence. American forces had suffered defeat after defeat since Pearl Harbor. There was little reason to believe Midway would be different. Then, at 10:24 a.m., dive bombers from USS Enterprise appeared through a gap in the clouds directly above the Japanese carrier formation. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Nagumo's 4 carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks shattered, hangars exploding from ignited ordnance, and their combat capability destroyed. The battle that Japanese planning expected to be a decisive victory became instead a catastrophic defeat that fundamentally shifted the Pacific War's trajectory. And the carrier that dealt the decisive blow, Enterprise, would earn a reputation among Japanese commanders as the single most dangerous ship in the American fleet, the vessel that turned the tide at Midway and hunted Japanese forces throughout the Pacific until war's end. The story of Enterprise at Midway begins not with the battle itself, but with the intelligence breakthrough that made American victory possible. Station Hypo, the Navy's code-breaking unit in Pearl Harbor, had been reading Japanese naval communications since before the war through systematic cryptanalysis of the JN-25 code system. By May 1942, the codebreakers had achieved sufficient understanding to read approximately 40% of intercepted messages, enough to identify broad operational plans, though specific details often remained unclear. The intercepts in late May indicated a major Japanese operation planned for early June, targeting a location designated AF in Japanese communications. Commander Joseph Rochefort, leading Station Hypo, believed AF was Midway Atoll based on communication patterns and references to positions relative to Hawaiian Islands. But Pacific Fleet Headquarters wanted confirmation before committing their limited carrier forces to a potentially decisive battle. If Rochefort's analysis was wrong, American carriers might be positioned incorrectly when the real Japanese attack came. Rochefort devised a simple test. He arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. 2 days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF is short of fresh water. The confirmation was conclusive. Rochefort could now tell Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, exactly where and when the Japanese would attack. This intelligence advantage was unprecedented in naval warfare, one side knowing the enemy's operational plan in detail days before execution. But intelligence alone didn't guarantee victory. The Japanese still outnumbered American forces, and their pilots were more experienced. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet, was one of the world's foremost naval strategists. His plan for Midway was complex and sophisticated, involving feints, diversions, and overwhelming force concentration designed to draw out and destroy the American carriers. Even knowing the plan, defeating it would require tactical execution that American forces hadn't yet demonstrated. Admiral Nimitz committed all available carriers to the battle. Enterprise and Hornet from Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown from Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier and should have required months of repair, but Pearl Harbor Navy Yard worked around the clock and returned her to service in 72 hours with temporary repairs sufficient for one more battle. This desperate effort gave American forces 3 carriers against 4 Japanese, narrowing but not eliminating the numerical disadvantage. The American carriers reached their ambush position northeast of Midway on June 3rd, undetected by Japanese reconnaissance. This was the first advantage conferred by intelligence. American forces knew where to be, while Japanese forces expected to achieve surprise. The second advantage was tactical patience. Admiral Fletcher, commanding overall operations, held his carriers back until Japanese intentions were clear, refusing to commit aircraft prematurely and reveal American presence. This discipline, born from earlier defeats, prevented the Japanese from detecting American carriers until after their attack on Midway had begun. The morning of June 4th began disastrously for American forces. Torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers attacked the Japanese formation in separate, uncoordinated strikes. The torpedo bombers, obsolete TBD devastators flying at low altitude at slow speeds, were massacred by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of 41 torpedo bombers from Hornet and Enterprise, 35 were shot down without scoring a single hit. The entire torpedo squadron 8 from Hornet was destroyed, all 15 aircraft and 29 of 30 crew members killed. The slaughter seemed to confirm Japanese superiority and suggest the battle was following predictable patterns. But the torpedo bomber attacks, though tragic failures, served crucial purposes that became clear only later. They drew Japanese fighter cover down to low altitude, leaving high altitude undefended. They disrupted Japanese carrier operations, forcing evasive maneuvers, and delaying the rearming operations that would prepare Japanese aircraft for strikes against American carriers. And most critically, they fixed Japanese attention on low-altitude threats while American dive bombers approached from high altitude, undetected and unopposed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, commanding Enterprise's air group, led 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers searching for the Japanese carriers. The American carriers had launched aircraft based on estimated Japanese positions, but the Japanese formation had maneuvered since those estimates were calculated. By 9:30 a.m., McClusky had reached the expected position and found empty ocean. He faced a decision that would determine the battle's outcome: return to Enterprise with fuel running critically low, or continue searching with the risk of running out of fuel before finding either targets or his carrier. McClusky chose to continue searching, gambling that the Japanese carriers were nearby and that finding them mattered more than his personal survival. He turned northwest, following his intuition about where the Japanese might be. At 10:05 a.m., he spotted a Japanese destroyer steaming at high speed, leaving a distinctive wake. McClusky recognized this as likely a screening vessel returning to the main formation and followed its course. At 10:20 a.m., he spotted the Japanese carriers. What McClusky saw was a target concentrator's dream. 4 Japanese carriers in close formation, flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, no fighter cover at altitude, and apparently unaware of approaching danger. The carriers were vulnerable in ways they never should have been, forced into this position by the cumulative effects of American torpedo bomber attacks that had disrupted their operations and drawn their fighters down to low altitude. McClusky ordered immediate attack, diving on the nearest carriers without waiting to coordinate with other formations. At 10:22 a.m., McClusky's dive bombers began their attack runs on Akagi and Kaga. 2 minutes later, dive bombers from Yorktown, arriving independently by different route, began attacking Soryu. The attacks were not coordinated, the result of coincidental timing rather than planned cooperation, but the effect was devastating. Within 5 minutes, all 3 carriers were burning, their flight decks shattered by 1,000-pound bombs that penetrated to hangars crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions from igniting ordnance transformed the carriers into infernos that damage control parties couldn't contain. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was hit by one bomb that struck near the central elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where armed aircraft awaited launch. The resulting explosion ignited aviation fuel and detonated stored ordnance, creating a chain reaction that destroyed the ship's interior. Damage control parties fought fires for hours, but by late afternoon, Akagi was abandoned and later scuttled by Japanese destroyers. She carried down nearly 270 crew members. Kaga took 4 direct hits and multiple near misses. Bombs penetrated the wooden flight deck and detonated in the hangar, igniting aircraft and fuel. The island structure was destroyed, killing most of the ship's senior officers. Fires spread throughout the ship, detonating magazines and creating explosions visible for miles. Kaga sank at 7:25 p.m., taking over 800 crew members with her, including most of her highly trained maintenance and flight operations personnel. Soryu was hit by 3 bombs from Yorktown's dive bombers. The carrier was smaller than Akagi and Kaga, less able to absorb damage. The bomb hits created fires that spread rapidly through the ship. Attempts to control flooding and fight fires simultaneously overwhelmed damage control capabilities. Soryu was abandoned after fires reached her magazines, which detonated at 7:13 p.m., breaking the ship's back and sinking her within minutes. Over 700 crew members died. 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were destroyed in 5 minutes by attacks totaling fewer than 40 dive bombers. The loss rate exceeded anything Japanese naval planners had contemplated. Carrier doctrine assumed that defending fighters, anti-aircraft fire, and evasive maneuvers would prevent concentrated attacks from achieving devastating hits. But the convergence of American torpedo bomber sacrifices, timing coincidence, and Japanese vulnerability from interrupted rearming operations created conditions where doctrine failed catastrophically. The 4th Japanese carrier, Huryu, was separated from the main formation and initially escaped attack. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, immediately launched counterattacks against the American carriers. At 12:00 p.m., 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters from Huryu found and attacked Yorktown, achieving 3 bomb hits that damaged the carrier and forced her to reduce speed. At 2:45 p.m., a second strike with 10 torpedo bombers achieved 2 torpedo hits that flooded Yorktown and stopped her completely. The carrier was abandoned that evening, though she remained afloat and was under tow when a Japanese submarine torpedoed and sank her on June 7th. Yamaguchi's attacks demonstrated that Japanese carrier aviation remained effective even after losing 3 carriers. The pilots from Huryu executed professional attacks that achieved hits against a defended target, showing that Japanese tactical excellence hadn't disappeared. But Huryu's success was temporary. American search aircraft located her at 2:45 p.m., and Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers at 3:30 p.m. for a late afternoon attack. The attack on Huryu came at 5:00 p.m., with Enterprise's dive bombers achieving 4 hits on the carrier. Like her sister ships, Huryu burned from ignited aviation fuel and exploding ordnance. Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship, choosing to go down with his carrier in accordance with Japanese naval tradition. Huryu sank the following morning, taking over 400 crew members including Yamaguchi, whose loss was particularly significant given his reputation as one of Japan's most capable carrier commanders. By the evening of June 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were destroyed or sinking. American losses were 1 carrier, Yorktown, and approximately 150 aircraft. The exchange rate, 4 Japanese carriers for 1 American carrier, was catastrophically unfavorable for Japan. More importantly, the loss of experienced aircrew, maintenance personnel, and ship's company represented losses that Japan's limited training pipeline couldn't quickly replace. The Americans could build new carriers and train new pilots. The Japanese couldn't replace what they'd lost at the rate required to maintain carrier aviation capability. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving reports of the carrier losses from his flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind the carrier force, initially couldn't accept what had happened. His carefully constructed plan, designed to overwhelm American forces through concentration and superior execution, had collapsed in minutes. He ordered the invasion of Midway canceled and began withdrawing surviving forces. The operation he'd planned to consolidate Japanese control of the Pacific had instead demonstrated that Japanese carrier forces were vulnerable to coordinated American attacks. The Japanese assessment of the battle, conducted over months of analysis and debate, consistently identified American dive bomber attacks as the decisive factor. But within that assessment, a specific judgment emerged. The dive bombers from Enterprise, commanded by McClusky, had delivered the decisive strikes against Akagi and Kaga. The decision to continue searching past the expected position, the coincidental timing that brought Enterprise bombers over Japanese carriers simultaneously with Yorktown's bombers, and the execution of attacks that achieved multiple hits had come from Enterprise's air group. This judgment became embedded in Japanese naval consciousness. Throughout the remainder of the war, Japanese commanders tracked Enterprise's movements, attempted to prioritize her for destruction, and recognized her as the most dangerous American carrier in service. Intelligence reports identifying Enterprise in operational areas prompted increased defensive preparations. Survivors of battles where Enterprise appeared consistently identified her aircraft as particularly aggressive and effective. The carrier earned nicknames among Japanese forces. The Gray Ghost for her ability to appear unexpectedly, Big E matching the American nickname, and among some units, simply, the ship that turned Midway. The reality was more complex than Japanese perception suggested. Enterprise was a well-run ship with experienced crew and skilled pilots, but she wasn't individually superior to other American carriers in ways that would explain Japanese fixation on her. What Enterprise represented was American carrier aviation at Midway. The intelligence that positioned American forces for ambush, the tactical patience that waited for the right moment, the courage of torpedo bomber crews who died drawing Japanese fighters down, and the skill and fortune of dive bomber pilots who arrived over Japanese carriers at the moment of maximum vulnerability. But perception matters in warfare, and Japanese perception that Enterprise was uniquely dangerous became self-fulfilling. By prioritizing her destruction, Japanese forces allocated resources and attention to tracking and attacking her specifically, sometimes at the expense of other tactical considerations. This focus provided advantage to other American carriers that operated with less Japanese attention. Enterprise herself benefited from having some of the Pacific Fleet's best commanders and crew, partly because she was recognized as important and received priority for experienced personnel. Enterprise's subsequent combat record validated Japanese concerns. She participated in more major actions against Japan than any other American carrier. Midway, Eastern Solomons, Santa Cruz, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She survived multiple bomb and kamikaze hits that would have sunk lesser ships. Her aircraft sank or damaged dozens of Japanese vessels. By war's end, Enterprise had earned 20 battle stars, the most of any American warship, and her crew had logged more combat days than any comparable ship. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942 saw Enterprise again facing Japanese carriers attempting to support operations around Guadalcanal. Japanese light carrier Ryujo was sunk by Enterprise aircraft, and Enterprise herself survived multiple bomb hits that killed 77 crew members and forced repairs. The battle reinforced Japanese belief that Enterprise was both dangerous to face and difficult to sink, a combination that made her a priority target whenever encountered. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, Enterprise aircraft participated in sinking the carrier Zuiho and damaging the fleet carrier Shikaku. Enterprise herself was hit by 3 bombs and survived, though requiring repairs that kept her out of action for 2 months. For the third time in 5 months, Enterprise had faced Japanese carrier forces, sunk enemy carriers, and survived despite taking damage. The pattern reinforced her reputation among Japanese commanders as a carrier that couldn't be reliably destroyed even when successfully attacked. The Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Enterprise's fighters participating in the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were shot down or destroyed during the battle, effectively ending Japan's carrier-based air power as an offensive force. Enterprise aircraft contributed to the sinking of carrier Hiyo and participated in strikes that damaged several other carriers. The battle demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted since Midway. American carrier forces now outnumbered and outclassed Japanese forces so thoroughly that battles became one-sided massacres. Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, included Enterprise in operations that sank the last Japanese carrier strike forces. The 4 carriers sunk during the battle, Zuikaku, Chitos, Chiyoda, and Zuiho, represented much of Japan's remaining carrier capability. Enterprise aircraft participated in strikes that overwhelmed Japanese defenses and destroyed carriers that had survived earlier battles. The symbolic closure of sinking Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor carrier still afloat, resonated with Enterprise crew members who had been hunting Japanese carriers since the war's beginning. The kamikaze campaigns of 1945 targeted Enterprise repeatedly. On May 14, 1945, a kamikaze penetrated the carrier's anti-aircraft fire and struck the forward elevator, causing extensive damage and killing 13 crew members. Repairs were completed in time for Enterprise to participate in the final months of the war, supporting operations around Okinawa and later conducting strikes against the Japanese home islands. Even at war's end, Enterprise remained operational and effective, having survived more combat than any American carrier and inflicted more damage on Japanese forces than any comparable ship. The crew's attitude toward their ship mixed pride with superstition. Enterprise had been in situations where sister ships were sunk, had taken damage that should have been catastrophic, and had repeatedly survived when odds suggested otherwise. Sailors spoke of the ship as being lucky, blessed, or protected. Officers privately acknowledged that much of Enterprise's survival came from skilled damage control, good captains who maneuvered effectively, and fighter direction officers who positioned defenses well. But the mythology of the ship as specially dangerous to Japan and specially resilient to damage became part of crew identity. Japanese survivors, interviewed after the war about their perceptions of American carriers, consistently mentioned Enterprise as the carrier they most feared encountering. This wasn't based on objective analysis of relative capabilities. By 1944, most American carriers were equivalently dangerous. But Enterprise's presence at Midway, her role in other early battles, and the accumulated reputation from 2 years of combat created psychological effects that influenced Japanese tactical decisions throughout the war. Commanders facing Enterprise operated more cautiously, potentially missing opportunities they might have exploited against carriers without her reputation. The technical capabilities that made Enterprise effective were common to all Essex-class carriers by 1944. Comprehensive radar systems, large aircraft capacity, effective anti-aircraft armament, and skilled crew. But Enterprise, as a Yorktown-class carrier, was actually slightly smaller and less capable than the Essex-class ships that formed the fleet's core by 1944. What distinguished Enterprise wasn't technical superiority but combat experience. Her crew had learned through 2 years of combat how to operate the ship effectively, how to launch and recover aircraft efficiently, how to coordinate defenses, and how to conduct repairs rapidly. This institutional knowledge was Enterprise's real advantage. The symbolic importance of Enterprise to American morale paralleled her tactical importance. She represented survival and victory in a war that began with catastrophic defeats. When newspapers reported Enterprise's exploits, they provided American public with evidence that the tide was turning. The carrier became a symbol of American determination and capability, a ship that had faced the Japanese repeatedly and prevailed. This symbolic role influenced crew morale and identity, creating expectations of excellence that the crew worked to maintain. The decision to preserve Enterprise as a museum ship after the war seemed inevitable given her combat record and symbolic importance. But post-war budget constraints and changing strategic priorities led instead to Enterprise being sold for scrap in 1958, a decision that many veterans and historians considered tragically short-sighted. The loss of Enterprise to scrap yards when lesser ships were preserved, as museums reflected institutional failure to recognize historical significance while focused on immediate budgetary concerns. The Battle of Midway's outcome depended on multiple factors: intelligence that positioned American forces effectively, torpedo bomber sacrifices that disrupted Japanese operations, timing coincidences that brought dive bombers over Japanese carriers at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and Japanese errors that left carriers exposed. But within that complex causation, Enterprise's role was central. Her air group, commanded by McClusky, delivered the strikes that destroyed 2 of the 4 Japanese carriers. Her continued operations throughout the war validated the victory at Midway by maintaining pressure on Japanese forces that never recovered from that initial defeat. Japanese commanders' assessment that one U.S. carrier turned the tide at Midway was simultaneously correct and misleading. Enterprise delivered decisive strikes, but she did so as part of a 3-carrier force supported by intelligence, land-based aircraft from Midway, and the sacrifices of torpedo bomber crews from all 3 carriers. The victory was systemic, not individual. But Enterprise's visibility in that victory, her subsequent combat record, and her survival through war's end made her the symbol of American carrier power that had surprised and destroyed Japanese carrier forces at Midway and continued hunting them until Japan's surrender. The one carrier that stunned Japanese commanders wasn't the only factor in American victory, but she was the most visible and enduring symbol of it. Enterprise represented the transition from defeat to victory, from Pearl Harbor's catastrophe to Midway's triumph, and from defensive operations to offensive dominance. Japanese commanders who fixated on Enterprise as uniquely dangerous weren't entirely wrong. They simply attributed to one ship characteristics that actually reflected the broader transformation of American naval power from 1942's defeats to 1945's overwhelming superiority. But perception shaped reality, and Enterprise earned her reputation through being present at crucial moments, delivering effective strikes when they mattered most, and surviving to fight again when other ships were lost. The Gray Ghost, Big E, the carrier that turned the tide at Midway, had earned every nickname through combat actions that justified Japanese commanders' stunned recognition that this one ship had fundamentally changed the Pacific War's trajectory.